a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, listeners. This is Brooke, co-host of Right Minded, and I wanted to let you know that I'm hosting one of my regular memoir events this spring, this time featuring Kiese Lehman, Mark Nepo, Joshua Moore, and Susan Liu, all of whom have been guests on this show. This is part of my Magic of Memoir series that I do with Linda Joy Myers, and a lot of effort goes into selecting the teachers we choose to teach these classes. We're always looking for people who walk their talk, who are charismatic and interesting, and bringing their own life experience to the fore. The topics we're covering this time around are truth, self-expression, self-forgiveness, and how to keep writing when people you love wish that you just stop, or maybe they're just ambivalent. If you've been a long-time listener of this show, you know I'm obsessed with Kiese Lehman. I think he is one of the brilliant minds of a generation, and just being in his presence when he speaks about writing is a true gift. Mark Nepo is a longtime friend of mine who Oprah Winfrey called one of the finest spiritual guides of our time. And Joshua Moore and Susan Liu have just been recent guests on the show, and I appreciate so much that they're going to dive into these powerful topics. Linda Joy and I will be teaching in the lineup as well, and we are looking forward to starting it all on March 4th, an auspicious day to begin things. So we invite you to March 4th and forward into whatever is calling you to be written. The event is called The Story of You, and we start March 4th. We invite you to check out all the details at magicofmemoir.com. Hello, explorers, advocates, visionaries, and seers. Welcome to Right Minded and another episode delivering your weekly writing inspiration. I'm Brooke Warner, here as always with Grant Faulkner. And Grant, we have so many opportunities to interview amazing writers. And today's guest, Tara Dorabji, is someone we know because she lives locally. It sounds like I met her and you didn't somehow at Faith Adiele's book launch last year.
Yeah.
But today we're going to talk about scope in fiction. But before I get to that, I feel compelled to say that I've known Tara for years as a journalist turned filmmaker. And then all of a sudden, when I saw her at this party, she told me she'd written a novel. And I was so impressed because I love the breadth of work. And I was just thinking about the multimedia-ness of it all. And I'd already been thinking about this theme of scope for this episode. And then it occurred to me that we could talk about scope also as it pertains to a singular novel and as it pertains to someone's career. Mm-hmm. So I thought we'd kind of dive into both of those things. And so to start, do you give much thought to your own scope, you know, when it comes to your work, like your career of what Grant does and how everything interconnects in your life?
I actually do, because when I'm introduced to speak at a conference or something, I often joke that I've written everything except for a vacuum cleaner manual in my writing career. And someday I'm going to write that vacuum cleaner manual, seriously. But I think one interesting thing about scope, well, they are intertwined, the scope of your career and the scope of your work. And I think the scope, at least of your career, it kind of just happens to you. You know, you don't necessarily plan on it. And I say that because when I started as a writer, I only wanted to write fiction. I didn't anticipate being a journalist or writing craft books or working in corporate communications or producing a TV show or leading a nonprofit or writing a memoir or co-hosting a podcast, you know?
Right.
And the list goes on and on. I haven't even mentioned everything. And I can't really explain how this all happened to me, but I think it's just because I'm open to opportunities and I enjoy trying new things. And on the other hand, though, I know some writers who are very rigidly defined, you know, and those are complimentary words because they do that to protect their art more. And, you know, for example, you know, they're poets and only poets, and they want to focus just on that. And I envy that narrowness of scope sometimes because I feel too spread out. And there's a lot to be said for having a focus that allows you to go deep instead of wide. And I think the number of hats you wear, like I was saying, it can determine the ambitions of your scope on the page, in other words.
That's so true. It's and so many writers, just by definition of what we do in the world, are sort of literary hustlers in a sense, you know, and maybe you have to be, but it's also about creativity. So I do love this conversation. And, you know, Tara won a pretty prestigious contest with Simon & Schuster. And I was thinking that what's special about her novel is the fact that it's shining light on the violence that's happening in Kashmir. And this is abuse by the Indian government against the people of Kashmir and a lot of other things. I mean, there's local militias, there's a lot going on. And we recently had Sadiqa Johnson on the show and we talked about historical fiction. Tara's book, I mean, it's so funny when we talk about historical because it's like 1966, 1970s. It's like, does that qualify as historical, but I think it's starting to. But this is a story that spans 1966 to present day, and even taking us beyond because it extends into 2030. But my favorite parts of the book were the modern parts. And she writes about abrogation, which happened in August of 2019. And this is when the Indian government revoked the special autonomous status of Kashmir, which resulted in the central government of India basically now overseeing their governance, which, of course, for the people of Kashmir was horrible because it makes them not autonomous and on their own, which is what they want. And then she also writes about the pandemic. And of course, we know how devastatingly awful that was in India, as in many parts of the world, but particularly in that region, it was, just awful. Hundreds of thousands of people died. And it's believed that, the death count is probably much higher than what was recorded. And so I learned a lot from reading the novel, but I was most struck by the organization. And that was why I wanted to talk about scope today, because the book is in 7 parts. And so it starts in 1974, reaching back to 66, because that's when the protagonist, Aisha, was born. But what Tara does is interesting because she chose to focus on these different sections, right? So it's 1974 is a whole section, 1983, 1994, 2010, 2019, 2020, and 2022. And all the while she's tracking Aisha's age as she goes through an arranged marriage, has a family, and then experiences and witnesses all of this oppression and violence in Kashmir. And so I love this container. I really think it's important to study other people's structures for a novel, and that this is such a great thing to look at if you're trying to tell a story that spans a long period of time, because I've seen other people do these kinds of epic novels and you'll end up with like a 500-page novel. And hers is much more digestible than that. So I'm curious, Grant, what your thoughts are just about scope in general. I'm not sure it's something we've touched upon all that much, which always delights me actually when we find an under-discussed theme after all this time.
How did that happen? 6 years. We haven't talked about scope. This one, I'm super interested in this because it occurs to me that I haven't written anything with like a truly large scope like this. And I think I thought I would when I first set out to be a writer. I've never written a multi-generational novel or a family saga, for instance, and my stories are very much of the present and very situational and interior. And I do think that scope can come about also in ways that don't rely on telling the story in like hundreds of pages. I don't think scope necessarily demands like a huge volumes, And I think of Borges, who wrote these really expansive stories of great scope, but he did so by like somehow giving the feeling of immensity on the page without going into all the details or the length of things. And he was just brilliant at that. But one thing I like about a novel of scope is that you're really exploring connections. So characters aren't marooned in the present, for example, but they're very much determined by other events, past and present. And characters they're also kind of caught in this larger web, showing that scope probably gives a more accurate sense of what life really is in terms of the dependencies and the influences that we all kind of live within, even if we don't recognize them. So I love thinking about this, and I'm going to think about scope the next time I start a story. So tell me a little bit about the scope and memoir, Brooke.
Yeah, scope comes up all the time with memoir, typically because many aspiring memoirists, people who are new to memoir, are needing to shift their thinking from memoir being the story of their whole life to being a slice of life. And that is scope, right? So I use images like the telescope or a frame to help my students kind of think about how to contain the stories that they want to tell. And it's important for a lot of reasons, of course, because it keeps the writer more disciplined and it can support you to really understand and know what your story is about and to tell scenes that pertain to that. And then in memoir, your book can't be about your whole life. It's not a good scope. It needs to be about something, right? So that could be about your relationship with your mother or about raising a neurodivergent child or about surviving an abusive relationship, to name a few of the common ones I see among my students and authors. And it's rare that students who take my class actually need to broaden their scope. Most often they need to narrow it. And so it's definitely a topic that I cover with students early on. And Grant, I'd love to hear you talk more about scope in your own writing, how you've thought about this in the past or with your memoir in progress. Have you been conscious of this? And are you a person who comes to the page with a more limited scope or a broader scope? Because I think that's a thing that, writers in general have to wrangle with.
Definitely. And wrangle's the right word, because when you ask this, it's ironic for me to think about scope in novels, since I did go through a brief period where I read all of William Faulkner, who I'm actually not related to. It was part of my dissertation when I was in grad school. But I was, really taken by, these immense knots and layers of his stories and how they went so deep into history and background. It was just a thicket that characters kind of, emerged from. And for a while, I did imitate his scope, and I think I utterly failed, though. So I think I shifted to a more quiet, intimate, and small scope in my fiction as a result, and it just kind of suits me better. Although I wonder if I should try it again. But with memoir, I think this is really interesting to think of, because, just hearing you talk about it now, since I'm working on my own memoir, and the gist of that is getting diagnosed with a number of severe heart problems. And then, afterwards kind of thinking about it and reckoning with my sickness and realizing they're not in isolation. The heart problems are part of a lifelong pattern of physical problems that have all been caused by what I'll call my, being a maniac in a bunch of different ways. So the memoir is really looking at a lifelong pattern of behavior and its consequences. And I'm also looking at a generational legacy of self-destructive behavior. But that said, at the same time, I think of the memoir as being somewhat, intimate, lyrical, and even small story. It's more reflection or meditation than it is a work that strives to tell the whole story with any kind of comprehensiveness. I shy away from any idea of comprehensiveness in everything I write. So I think it's more like a poetry collection, except told in prose. So perhaps, this is all to say that scope can take different shapes. And even though my memoir tackles family history and medical science and psychology, it's also not big, so you can go wide and go small almost at the same time. Mm-hmm. So what about you, Brooke? How do you deal with scope in your memoir?
Well, I've wrestled with it too. My memoir in progress that I am slowly chipping away at does span 10 years. So that's the scope. And I would love to have a story that's like a perfect tight container. Like, to me, Wild by Cheryl Strayed is one of the best memoirs of all times, because she does have this perfect container of hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, which took her 3 months. And then inside of that hike, she unpacks her past about losing her mom primarily, but also her failed marriage and her own reactivity and self-destruction in the wake of losing her mom. But not all of us have a tight container like that. And so that's when I was just very inspired by Maggie Smith's You Could Make This Place Beautiful. And her scope is wider and more kaleidoscopic in nature. Mm-hmm. And it covers a similar territory as my book, and also has multiple themes. And so I kind of changed my entire scope. I mean, not my scope, but maybe how I was going to tell the story after I read that book. And I think a lot of people did, actually. Yeah. Like, she sort of like was a game changer. Everyone I would talk to at the time was saying that. Yeah. So funny. I was like unhappy and bored with my narrative, right? So scope is important to wrangling the unwieldiness of a given story and finding your way through it. And then scope is also a question of structure, right? It's connected to form. Mm-hmm. And I was struck that in her acknowledgments, Tara thanks her early readers. Some of them were people from Kashmir who contributed to this book, or her understanding of it anyway. And I really liked how she specifically credits them, for how, well, she said the form of this book ended up taking the form that it did because of them. So I thought that was pretty cool. So Grant, reading is, of course, one way to be inspired to find the right scope. I'm curious if there's anything else you'd recommend. How can writers find their way if they're struggling with the bigness of their story?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think what you touched on, just the weight of telling a linear narrative, that linear narrative that marches to the pace of this kind of like, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then that happened.
Right.
It's kind of a burdensome way to tell a story to some. It is to me. So I totally sympathize with the moment, you got bored with your memoir, and like millions of other memoirs, sought out Maggie Smith's example. Mm-hmm. I did too, by the way. I was very inspired by that and felt kind of validated in that structure. Robert Frost, he has this famous quote. He says, "No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader." So I think you could say that, part of scope is in the structure you tell the story in. So if you're feeling bored by the linear quality of your story, you might think about how to modulate it and change its shape. And I think for me, this is a lesson of flash fiction that I've learned, is that sometimes it's good to focus on evoking scope instead of conveying it in a more kind of step-by-step chronological fashion.
Yeah, it just reminds me too of when I saw Salman Rushdie recently in Kauai, and he was talking about story as a sphere, and this idea that an entry point in a story is like slicing the sphere. And I thought that was such an interesting visual, in part because slicing a sphere is a very mathematical way of looking at story, and my brain rarely goes to math metaphors. But you can slice a sphere at any point on the sphere, and when it breaks open, both sides are circles. I just thought that was kind of a lovely concept as a metaphor that I've really been thinking about ever since.
Yeah, that's a great image, and it's almost like a Zen koan, I think. I think it gets at what I was saying about evoking the story. When you write with suggestion and rely more on images or scenes to create a larger mood, then you can have a sense of play and a sense of poetry. And I think writing for the poetry of the story is more fun than writing for the facts of a story. Although with memoir, you have to do both. But the scope is tied to structure and language and tone and all the craft elements that go into a story. And I really enjoyed this conversation because I don't think I'd thought of it quite in these terms until now. So I look forward to hearing more about what Tara has to say about scope and other things after this short break.
Welcome back, everyone. We have Tara Dorabji with us today. She is the author of the novel Call Her Freedom, winner of the Simon & Schuster Books Like Us first novel contest. She is the daughter of Parsi Indian and German-Italian migrants. Her documentary film series on human rights defenders in Kashmir won awards at over a dozen film festivals throughout Asia and the USA. Tara's publications include Al Jazeera, the Chicago Quarterly, and other acclaimed anthologies, including Good Girls Marry Doctors and All the Women in My Family Sing. She's joining us, a fellow Bay Area person. She lives here with her family and rabbit. Welcome, Tara.
Thanks so much for having me, Brooke and Grant. It's such an honor to be with you.
Well, it's an honor for us, too. It's great to have you on the show. Thank you. And congratulations. This is your debut novel, and so that's always accompanied by a lot of anticipation and nerves. So could you tell us about what inspired this story? Why Kashmir? Why Aisha? What's the origin story of Call Her Freedom?
Call Her Freedom really began, I think, as a lot of writers in their pursuit of looking at family history. So I got a hold of letters from when my dad migrated, from my grandmother who had passed away, grandfather. And so I started doing sort of an autofiction piece. And this really distinct voice came through, a young girl living in a militarized land that was in proximity, but completely separate. And suddenly I was like, wow, I think this character coming is living in Kashmir. And at the times, there were the summer uprisings where you had 1 million people on a given day out in the streets. And it was largely women and children in this huge nonviolent uprising. And so I became really curious about it and started researching and learning that Kashmir is one of the most densely militarized lands on Earth. And so I really followed the characters. They led me to Kashmir, and there, through my research, I learned so much about the culture, resilience, resistance, and occupation, which really inspired Call Her Freedom and led to its creation.
Brooke and I were both struck by the scope of your novel, and it takes place from 1969 to 2022, and also has an epilogue that takes us all the way to 2030. And, of course, there's plenty of precedents for epic novels, but there's just something special about how you unfold this story, focused as it is on global events and circumstances and revolution and the pandemic. So I'd love to know how you landed on what the scope of the story would be.
It was, I'm a writer who discovers and really lets the characters lead, which takes time. So there were sections that were removed at some times, and largely how I came to the final form was really looking at what were the critical times in the family's life, and then mapping that to the occupation of the land. And a lot of times they intersected. And so some of the sections of the story came later. They weren't on the page, and readers that were hungry and giving me feedback were like, what happened here? We missed this part. And so that helped me focus on those parts of it in the time. I think for me, one of the biggest gifts was writing into the future. And I think in some ways it's such the pursuit, right? As artists and creatives, is if we can hold a mirror now and understand things a little more deeply and differently, can we change where we're going individually and collectively? And so it was really exciting and sort of a beautiful practice to write into the future. Also, as the timeline for the novel changed, the timeline for the book and like where the world was and where the audience would be changed. So as we entered into the pandemic, that was a huge creative choice. Do I bring this into this time and beyond? And I could see a case for both, but ultimately writing into the future was what Call Her Freedom asked me to do.
That's so interesting. So I'm guessing you started, like you said, writing about this uprising. Is that abrogation?
Abrogation? No, it was more
the peaceful protests, I guess. Or yeah. Tell me how you would characterize it.
Yeah, I mean, those actually happened in the summers of 2008, 9, and 10. And so even though that's what inspired the book, this is an interesting point, that wasn't particularly the timeline that made it. And abrogation is in around 2019. So those two things coalesce.
Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about abrogation? Because I was very curious about this. Like, I was like, oh, this is historical fiction. But then we hit abrogation, which I'd love for you to tell people, because I didn't know what it was. And that was in 2019. And then sounds like the pandemic happened. And so then you're writing into the future, but you're like, okay. And then there's this whole section on the pandemic. And I really loved it because I was, like I said, I was sort of taken aback in a very great way about like, oh, I'm reading this historical 1970s, but here we go, 50 years ago. And then bringing into the future. And this woman is, like more or less my age and living this very different life. And I just love for you to say more about specifically those sections about abrogation and the pandemic and this whole thing of spanning so many decades.
I mean, part of it was also being able to have a character that we meet as a child and then meet her and know her as a grandmother and the different things we face and choices we make as a child, as a daughter, as a mother, and then grandmother. And so that was really important to the story. And then from the research standpoint, I went to Kashmir in 2018. So was able to see the difference in the land between 2011 and 2018. It was so much more repressed when I was there, even under a ceasefire. I mean, a young artist was killed while I was there after Friday night prayers. He was out protesting and they ran him over with an army vehicle during Ramadan, during a ceasefire. So the ground and the conditions were deteriorating and becoming more occupied in the current reality. And so that went very much into the novel. And then in 2019, India changed their constitution. So when Kashmir, the Indian administered part at the time of, quote, independence, went with India, they had a semi-autonomous status. So basically, the agreement was India was supposed to take care of their exterior borders. They have internal autonomy. Only Kashmiris can own land. And 2019, that was stripped. So it was one of the largest media blackouts in human history. Internet was down. I mean, there was no papers being printed. There was, I think, one paper that found a hand press. So they would print like maybe 300 copies and then people would distribute them and share them. So one paper would go hand to hand to hand. And that was how, people were back to like pen and paper. It was just like, and even, since then, the conditions have deteriorated tremendously. The papers have been dismantled. Journalists are incarcerated, dear friends, human rights defenders. And so that reality did very much shape the novel. And then, in some of the interviews I did within the pandemic, what struck me is somebody said, we're in a lockdown within a lockdown. So the actual conditions of the pandemic are just another excuse for further repression. We're already in a space where we store rice for 3 months because we don't know when we can leave. And there could be, folks are used to living where they're in curfew for days on end. That means you're not leaving the house. So the reality of the occupation and siege of Kashmir and the intensifying militarization by India definitely seeded its way into Call Her Freedom as, unfortunately, it grew more and more repressive as I continued to research and follow the stories and journey.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tara, I want to talk about some of your characters in the book, and Aisha is your primary point of view character, but there are many others. And some of your characters, like Murad and Alim, they get a lot of airtime, whereas others just have a single vignette. So I'm curious, what were your considerations when it came to, who got to have a point of view in this story?
Yeah, the characters would argue about this.
As they
Noor
should.
Jahan, yeah, she's Aisha's mom. It was very clear to me that I was not going to be able to write from her point of view. She's a complex, powerful midwife, very intense character. And so actually writing from her perspective was beyond sort of the scope of what even I could do. So for her, she haunts the book. And if I couldn't figure something out, I'd write her letters. And so that was a very clear agreement. And then I would let the story unfold. And sometimes I would try different perspectives. And then certain characters came in and their voice sort of exploded on the page. Like, I wasn't aware that Nalja was going to hold so much of the story, but it really became her story towards the end that we follow and land with. And so I was surprised by who needed to tell which parts. And what I found is, each of us is in our own perspective. That's part of our human experience. And so there was a great sort of creative capacity and practice in being able to explore the different characters and how would that change the truth and also the conflicts, because we could see the conflict from a really different perspective, a lot of the interpersonal ones, when we changed point of view. And so a lot of the times it was choosing characters that would give more dimension to how we understand and perceive things, and hope that the contradictions that seem almost like too much of a duality to hold, those polarities then allow for greater truths to emerge.
Beautifully said, Tara. Thank you. Before this, you made a short film about torture in Kashmir, and your book is obviously set there and covers subjects that include torture, murder, and rape. And it seems to me, I'd like you to speak more about it, a mission of yours to bring awareness to what's happening there. And so could you tell us about your art as activism and how you view using film and fiction as a form of advocacy and fighting against injustice?
I think art is one of the most transformational tools we have for social change, and each medium allows us to look at stories in different ways. And so when I went to Kashmir, the immediacy of the occupation and repression, as a journalist, folks opened up to me and they shared stories with deep urgency. And one woman said, when I know that people outside of here hear my story, that gives me hope. And with fiction, the timeline is incalculable. Maybe, so I had no idea when this novel would come out, and yet people had such urgent stories that they were sharing with me from a place that's so censored and repressed. And so I would take whatever avenues I had as a storyteller. And first it was radio. And then on my 2018 trip, because a lot of journalists, once they cover the occupation, get denied access to Kashmir, I was pretty cautious about my return, and also felt a deep obligation to be able to document stories in the most powerful way that I could. And at the time, I was working with the Brave New Voices International Youth Poetry Festival, which is powered by Youth Speaks. We were creating a lot of short films, the 3 to 6 minute. And so I worked with one of the independent film makers based here in the Bay Area, Jamie DeWolf, and we decided, I inspired him to come with me to Kashmir so that we could also film upon returning. And I didn't really have a whole lot of shape to those films. When I landed, I knew that there was urgent stories and that we had capacity to tell them. So I knew I wanted to do short form, but I really worked in partnership with folks who told stories in the community to surface what are the stories that are going to support advocacy and human rights work right now. And so that became a really steep learning curve and beautiful process. Creating a short film on torture was very challenging. It's a heavy, difficult topic. And the Human Rights Group was releasing one of the first comprehensive reports on torture from the region. So having a film that could make it more accessible to civil society was a huge, was a complementary addition to the campaign. It pushed the conversation further and forwarded really powerful work. And I think a lot of times, I would have longer conversations with folks, but sometimes the interviews, there were folks that would translate for me, and I would just hold a mic and people would tell me their story how they wanted to. And so I think here in the US, there's a lot around how do we tell stories? Like, is it okay to share trauma? Like, what part of it? And so for me, it was like I had to step back and understand that folks wanted to tell their story and how they wanted to tell it. And my job was to capture it. And a lot of the stories that came out were really, really, really difficult and hard to hold. And so as I produced more and more of the films, I was able to go back and get additional interviews and footage and talk around the culture and the resilience and build up and show like both sides. That became really important. And, the thing is, folks are really suffering, and it's important for them. There was a deep desire for that to be made known to the world because they're told, though, that it doesn't exist. There's like a narrative held by the occupying forces in India that's a narrative control that this does not exist, but they're experiencing it. And so really wanting to bring that forth.
Well, Tara, you're the winner of the Simon & Schuster's Books Like Us first novel contest, and I didn't know that such a thing existed. So I was wondering if you can share more about what this is and what it means to you to have won this contest.
It's really a dream, and it was actually Faith Adiele, who's in my writing group, who sent me the notification. And she actually has the only sort of verified transmission of the date of when it happened because you're so used to rejection as a writer. So she sent it to me. I submitted. I didn't have any type of copy of it, which means I submitted directly into the portal. I did it as like a rote exercise, and then summarily forgot about it until I was notified that I was a semifinalist. And when you submitted, you submitted 25 pages, and then once you were semi-finalist, the rule is you have 6 days to give them the entire manuscript. And so I was, and I was in some like deep edit where I had pulled apart the structure, was dealing with 3 different sections. There was no intention of me sharing this work in this state. And so I just, it became very serious, and it's been a real dream. Winning has been incredible. I have an amazing editor, fantastic publicist, the cover art, so many of the pieces, the novel itself, even the title came through working with my editor. So the novel is so much better. And the contest is really important, and the mission of it to have underrepresented stories heard. And there are so many incredible writers and stories out there. And so I really hope that in publishing Call Her Freedom, it creates more pathways for more stories to get out there. And, this is an incredible opportunity, but each writer finds their own path. I had many, many, many rejections before I arrived here.
Well, congratulations. And the book is just out. And of course, we wish you the best with it. It's really beautifully done. And we've been asking you about scope because we tend to home in on a theme. And I thought, the scope of your novel is such an interesting story and how you present it is so interesting. But for the final question, I actually wanted to extend the question of scope to marketing and publicity, because I think it's relevant. And we have lots of people who are, either hoping to be authors someday or thinking about what happens post-publication. So is your publicity team recommending that you have a niche focus when it comes to reaching your readers, or is it more broad? And either way, I'm just wondering if you could share with us an area of focus that, post-publication experience is feeling like it's working for you as a debut novelist.
I would say that the market changes continually. So what's amazing is the team they know what's working and they're open to trying different things. And for Call Her Freedom, we have been focusing on podcasts. Mm-hmm. So that's been really fun and exciting. Cool. Yes. And I think it makes sense because they're specific. It's so specific small markets with dedicated listenerships, and as well as some of the bigger outlets. And we've been able to talk a lot about the inspiration for the story, why these stories are important, and the journey to getting Call Her Freedom published. And so that's been a really, exciting frame for the conversations because it's what drives me in doing the work. And so being able to connect your own passion for the work for how it gets into the world, I think is really essential for any piece. And the other thing that I've really enjoyed is I get a lot of long form. So almost all my interviews have been around an hour, somewhere half an hour, but I really get to have conversations with other amazing artists and writers and folks who deeply appreciate literature. And I learn a lot from those conversations. It's emergent for me. And so that makes it a real joy. So I would say find your joy in it. I think that's really, really important. And then I'm definitely a fan of no outlets too small and no outlets too big, as long as it aligns with your purpose and you can have an authentic conversation around the work and what drives you to do it, then that's the right match.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Tara, and congratulations. We're excited for you and hope the book gets out widely.
Thank you so much for having me and for all your work. It's been a delight to be here.
A delight for us as well, Tara. Thank you. We will be right back with this week's Substacking.
Grant, sometimes I like to use this Substacking section to bring attention to people who are doing great things on Substack. And so that's what came up for me this week. I wanted to give a shout out to Friends in Fiction, which is a podcast, web show, and online community created by the best-selling authors Mary Kay Andrews, Kristen Harmel, Christy Woodson Harvey, and Patty Callahan Henry. And they also recently featured Tara on their show, and they do interviews and office parties and all kinds of cool stuff. It's a great resource, but I just thought when I was looking up Tara and saw them, I'm like, okay, great, giving them a shout out because they're pretty aligned with what we do.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so many great people on Substack supporting authors in all kinds of ways. And I saw recently that you guest posted on someone else's Substack, Sub Club, and you wrote a post for them called Why Authors Should Treat the Querying Process Like a Job Interview. And it's a great post, and it seems worth calling attention to the fact that writers can and do guest post on other people's Substacks. So I'm curious, Brooke, what do you make of that strategy for getting your work out into the world or for growing your own visibility?
Yeah, I think it's wholly dependent on the writer and what you think you're going to get out of giving your content away. Because on Substack, I don't know very many places that are paying for content. I tend to say yes to these kinds of things if the platform has a good readership. I don't know that I got all that much exposure from Sub Club, but I appreciated the ask, and it wasn't too big a lift. They just asked me for a 500-word post. That said, since I'm doing my own writing, it was harder than I thought to get it done, and I was a day late in submitting the piece. So there's that. But generally for new writers, aspiring writers, I think getting your work on someone else's popular Substack is a great strategy for increasing your own readership.
Yeah, I know that Sari Botten runs a couple different Substacks. One's called Memoir Land, and the other one is called Oldster. And by the way, everyone is an Oldster. That's part of
right.
what Oldster is. So anyway, she features guest posts, and she has 50,000 subscribers on Oldster and 30,000 on Memoir Land. And just coincidentally, guess this is a good time to announce that I'm going to have a guest post on Oldster, all about turning 60, which I just did. And I also invited Sari to come on Right Minded, so we'll hear more from her in the near future about both of those and more. I hadn't really thought about it too much in terms of getting my work out and getting extra subscribers to my Substack. I just, thought it'd be fun to do the interview, but getting your work out to other audiences, it's a great opportunity. And it's basically the modern equivalent of getting your work published in a magazine. And this does definitely help build your author platform too. Brooke, do you think, I'm curious about on the other end of this, do you think that publishers are impressed by authors who guest post for other Substacks? Does it move the needle at all?
As with everything in publishing, it's all about the numbers. And so, yes, it will be meaningful on two fronts if the Substack has a big following, but more importantly, if your post gets lots of likes and comments. So if a Substack has a huge following and then your post gets no engagement, I would actually say that would be the opposite of great. It could even be a ding against you. I haven't really seen that though, so I'm just sort of speculating. It is interesting how big a change this is in book publishing, though, because if you think about magazines back in the day, all that mattered was the circulation numbers. Like, you didn't really know who was engaging, though I guess if you sort of figure if someone's paying for a magazine, chances are they're reading it regularly. Nowadays, of course, we see the engagement with the likes and comments, so it's such a different world.
One thing I find interesting about Substack is that a lot of people, they read my posts in their emails rather than on the platform. And I think Substack tracks that as an open or read in our stats. But when someone takes the time to email me in response to a post I've written, which I love, but I'll sometimes just gently ask them to please post their comment on the post itself, because this goes to your point, the engagement and comments on the post is what raises the visibility of a given post. And I guess this is something to ponder. Are we doing this for likes and comments?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you'll agree with this take, Grant. Yes, right? But it's more nuanced than that, too. I know I'm doing Substack to reach my readers, but you and I put a ton of time into our posts. And so I appreciate a public comment more, just because the likes beget more likes and more comments, and shares support Substackers to find new readers. So as a reader and an engager on Substack, you're actually supporting the writers that you like the most by engaging with their stuff, and leaving a public comment is one of the way to do that. And I will say that I'm honestly as happy when someone gives me like a comment or a like as I am when someone signs up to be a paid subscriber. So that's saying a lot.
Yeah.
But of course, we all have different motivations. So how about you, Grant? How do you think about that engagement?
I have to say that I'm very motivated, inspired, and fueled by the engagement I get on Substack. I tell people that I work for their comments, and it's true. I mean, our newsletters aren't just Facebook posts or tweets. People have to spend 5 to 10 minutes reading or commenting on them. So it's a commitment, and I'm just so deeply touched when someone finds something I've written meaningful. And the irony to this is that I've become more dedicated to my Substack than I have been to my fiction writing as a result.
Right.
So I need to find a better balance, but in many areas of my life, but we'll start there. With that, I just want to thank our listeners for being such wonderful supporters for both of our Substack newsletters and the Right Minded Substack as well. And just thank you also for listening to Right Minded. We really do work for your listenership and your comments, and we don't do it for money, believe it or not, because we don't get money. So please keep listening, reading, and commenting. I'll see you next week.